Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Austin's American Flyer YouTube page. Today we're taking a look at a 290 American Flyer Pacific. That means wheel arrangement are 4 small wheels in the front, 3 large drivers on each side, and a trailing truck. This particular engine was part of a set that I was able to get from a lady by the name of Anne. Her father had this set for many years, but he passed away, and these parts and pieces went into storage. And when she got them out, nothing worked. So what I'm showing you here is just an elementary review of the engine. I noticed there's a screw missing from the bottom. I noticed that the frame is loose in the shell. I also noticed that the communicator is scorched, and suspect that that may be the main reason why the engine does not work. But this is just a cursory overview. So I decided I'm going to kind of take things apart, starting in the tender, and work forward. Now everything being done here is in high speed, just because it would take forever if it wasn't. But what I'm showing here is taking apart the E unit. This tender is old enough that it has tabs in the corners, so I undid those. Here I am taking loose the E unit itself. It did look pretty good from the outside. However, typically at least one set of fingers on an E unit have holes in them, which inhibits the ability of the current to pass properly. And so I took the fingers off, and sure enough, that was the case here. While I had things apart, I polished the drum, and I polished the one set of fingers that remained, and reassembled everything, and then tested it, and found that it did indeed rotate and work. So the next thing I did then was start with the wheels and pickup, which I polished everything very well. And then after everything was polished, I went ahead and cleaned it. Using some attachments on a Dremel tool, which you'll see shortly. I also used alcohol on Q-tips on the plastic parts of the wheels to get the debris and years of accumulated oil and sludge off of those. And if there was any white residue on the wheels, you can do one of two things. You can either spend quite a bit of time with alcohol and a Q-tip working on that, or if it's a little more extreme, there's another option, which I'll show shortly. But as you can see, I use several different attachments for the Dremel tool. There's a cotton/wool wheel. There's a wire brush attachment. There's also a kind of a Scotch-Brite type of wheel that I use. And typically we'll start with the more aggressive Scotch-Brite style wheel, and then move to the metal, and then finally the cloth/cotton for final polish. But I must confess, one of my favorite things to do is what happens here, where you have these wheels that are tarnished from 20, 30, 40 years of not being used, and they turn into this beautifully shiny, polished wheel. Here is one of the things that I recently heard about. If you have that white residue on old Flyer plastic, it comes from chemicals in the plastic itself kind of leaching out. And one very handy way to get rid of that is a hairdryer. You simply heat up the surface. Obviously you don't want to overdo it, but you heat it up and it causes the white to basically liquefy, and then you can take a Q-tip or cloth or something and wipe it off. These trailing truck wheels were pretty bad, so I did some additional cleaning with some tools, some small tools I had, to get some of the debris off, because the Q-tip was not able to get some of that. So tender's done. Now I'm moving here to the engine, where I take everything apart, and I'm being careful as I do this, because you don't know, what kind of shape things are in. It's also very hard with slotted screws to sometimes get them out, and so you got to be careful, which I know this is sped up, but I was very careful to not strip the heads off of those screws. As I took things apart, and because I noticed the shell was loose on the frame, I suspected there might be some actual damage to either the die-cast shell itself or something else was going on. And lo and behold, sure enough, there was some broken die-cast inside, and one of the tabs at the back, which hold the frame of the motor and wheel assembly, was missing. And so those are two things I wanted to look at repairing. Fortunately though, some of those bits and pieces of die-cast were found in the shell. Alright, so here I've got everything apart. I first of all hooked the tender up now that I've got everything cleaned up, and see if I can get the engine to respond. And when that doesn't happen, I check some continuity with a meter from front to back, just seeing, do the things show that they've got good connection. In other words, are the solder joints good? Are the wires connecting points A and B good? And that seemed to check out, surprisingly. So as I mentioned, I saw the communicator was scorched, and here, after taking the shell off, I see that the field is pretty dark as well. So what I decided to do is polish things up very well. So here you can see the armatures coming off. Obviously it's dark, but I did notice that the brushes were actually in good shape. I'm surprised at how long they are, so they probably were replaced at some point when there wasn't many more. They don't have very many hours of runtime on them. So that was a little bit of a surprise. I also noticed that there were two different kinds of springs. So for some reason, one of the springs had been replaced, and one of them was original. But here I am going ahead and polishing up the surface of the armature. It's always nice to check that, make sure there's not any deep ruts in it from years of service. And after a good polish, you also want to clean out the grooves between the separate plates, because over time those get bits of debris in them and they can cause some issues. One of the other things that I've found in past repairs, and this was no different on this one, is the jacks at the back of the engine where the tender actually plugs in. Over years those get corrosion in them, and it's hard to see because of the aluminum metal content. It doesn't show oxidation very well, but I cleaned those out, and here you see me actually getting the engine to move a little bit. I was pleasantly surprised. Again, didn't get a lot of activity, wasn't very strong movement. I wasn't sure if I was having some issues with the E-unit or if it had to do with the way the jack wires were connected, because at some point someone had actually soldered one of the pins into the jack on the engine. So anyhow, I did some more cleaning, some more prep, and put things a little bit stationary, a little bit up on blocks, and then ran some more tests and got things to work a little bit. Here you can see some of the broken threaded areas at the front, and obviously the tab is missing. So here I put a small piece of brass on the existing tab, marked it out, and then I added a second piece of brass to make that a little bit thicker, and soldered those together, cleaned those up, and then went ahead and put those in with some JB weld. And here I am preparing the threads and putting in a couple of small pieces that fell out of the shell of the engine. And after you use JB weld, you want to let it set for a good 24 hours, and so that tends to give you a good firm hold, and that was the case here. Alright, true to form, I thought, well, we've gone this far, let's go ahead and make this thing spit in polished. So I decided to work on the valve gear and side rods. Also gave the white walls a little bit of attention on the side of the engine. The shell of the engine actually is very clean to begin with, so it's not nearly as dirty as some that I've worked on, but they certainly do look nice when you clean them up a little bit. So I thought, since I had everything apart, this would be worthwhile doing this. And I also was cognizant that, again, Anne's looking at this video, remembering this as a kid, and I wanted to honor her and honor the memory of her father by doing the absolute best restoration I could on this engine. So I also, in addition to all the cleaning, polishing, I did just a tiny bit of touch-up on the paint. There are a couple places where there had been some scuffs and that kind of thing. And it's not perfect. I wasn't after perfection, but some of the omissions of paint, I did go ahead and touch those up a little bit. Here I am reassembling side rods, front truck, after I've gotten those cleaned up again, lubricated, and side rods, putting those back on. And one of the things that I like to do is put some lightweight grease on valve gear and running gear, anything where there's going to be some friction. The idea being that it'll just keep things moving more freely. And here is the assembled engine, cleaned up very nicely and looks just wonderful. And so I was quite anxious to see what would happen here.